There's a special kind of loneliness that comes when the people you love most simply walk away. For 62-year-old Mitch Rowen, that pain arrived when his wife left without a word, and his 3 grown children stopped returning his calls. Sitting alone in an empty house, he made a choice. He drove into the mountains to find his father's abandoned cabin, a structure that had been falling apart for 40 years. With just a tent and basic tools, Mitch began rebuilding it by hand. Day after day, he worked alone. Then something unexpected happened. His work brought strangers, then neighbors, then finally his children back home. Could rebuilding a broken cabin really bring a broken family together? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mitch Rowen had spent 35 years believing he understood his life. He'd married Diane Foster when they were both 27, young enough to think love was simple and old enough to know better. They'd built what everyone called a good life, a split-level house in a quiet suburb outside Asheville, 3 healthy children, steady work as a civil engineer for the county. He'd designed bridges and water systems, things that lasted, things people depended on without ever thinking about them. That was the kind of man he'd been, dependable, invisible in the best way. His children had grown up in that house. Kyle, the oldest at 34, worked in IT somewhere in Charlotte and called every few months. Brenna, 31, taught elementary school in Raleigh and sent occasional texts with photos of her classroom. Joanna, the youngest at 28, had moved to Atlanta for a marketing job and kept her distance even before everything fell apart. They were good kids, adults now really, but somewhere along the way, they'd stopped needing him. He'd told himself that was natural, even healthy. Children were supposed to leave. What he hadn't expected was for Diane to leave too. The signs had been there if he'd chosen to see them. For the last 2 years of their marriage, she'd grown quieter. She'd stopped asking about his day. She'd taken up watercolor painting and spent hours in the spare bedroom with her easel, door closed. When he'd peek in, she'd smile, a small, distant smile that didn't reach her eyes, and tell him she was fine, just focused. He'd believed her because it was easier than asking deeper questions. Retirement had come last spring. Mitch had turned 62 in March, and by May he'd cleaned out his office and handed in his county badge. He'd imagined this time differently, travel maybe, or finally building that workshop in the garage. Diane had mentioned wanting to visit the coast, to rent a place in Oregon for a month and paint the ocean, but he dragged his feet, uncertain what to do with days that had no structure, no purpose. The weeks had drifted by. He'd watched television. He'd organized the garage 3 times. He'd felt himself becoming smaller. Then one morning in late June, he'd woken to silence that felt different. Diane's side of the bed was made, corners tucked with the precision she'd always used. Her closet was half empty. The bathroom counter where her lotions and creams had cluttered the surface was clean, bare, except for his electric razor and a bar of soap. He'd walked through the house, calling her name, knowing she wouldn't answer. In the kitchen, the coffee maker was cold. Her favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle she'd refused to throw away, was gone. No note, no explanation, just absence. He'd tried calling. Her phone went straight to voicemail. He'd texted, "Where are you? Are you okay? Please call me." Nothing. He'd called Kyle first, then Brenna, then Joanna. Kyle had sounded annoyed. "Dad, I'm in a meeting," and promised to call back later, but didn't. Brenna had been gentler but distant. "I'm sure she's fine, Dad. Maybe she just needs some space." Joanna hadn't answered at all. For 3 days, he'd waited. He'd sat in the living room where they'd watched 35 years of television together, where they'd opened Christmas presents and argued about paint colors and fallen asleep on the couch during movies. The house had felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. On the 4th day, he'd found himself standing in the garage, staring at a cardboard box he hadn't opened in decades. Inside was his father's old leather tool belt, cracked and stiff with age, but still intact. Frank Rowen had worn that belt every weekend, building things, fixing things, always working with his hands. Mitch lifted it out carefully, the leather cool against his palms, and something shifted in his chest. Beneath the tool belt were photographs. His father at the cabin site in 1978, grinning beside a pile of freshly cut logs. His mother sitting on what would have been the front steps, holding a thermos of coffee. And Mitch himself, maybe 14 years old, shirtless and sunburned, holding a hammer like he knew what to do with it. The cabin. He hadn't thought about it in years. His father had bought the land in the Blue Ridge Mountains when Mitch was 12, 10 acres of forest and rock, with a clearing that looked out over the valley. Frank had dreams of building a family retreat, a place to escape to on weekends and summers. He'd drawn up plans, rough sketches on graph paper that showed a 2-room cabin with a loft and a stone fireplace. Every weekend for 3 years, they'd driven up together, father and son, and worked on it. They'd cleared the land, poured a foundation, raised walls from hand-hewn logs Frank had cut himself. Then Frank had gotten sick. Lung cancer, fast and brutal. He died 6 months after diagnosis, and the cabin had died with him. Mitch's mother had sold off most of Frank's tools but kept the land, unable to let it go entirely. When she'd passed 5 years later, the property had transferred to Mitch. He'd paid the taxes every year without thinking much about it, a small line item in the family budget. He'd never gone back. Now, sitting in his empty garage with his father's belt in his hands, Mitch felt something he hadn't felt in months. A pull, a direction. He'd spent the next 2 days searching for the deed, digging through filing cabinets until he found the original survey maps and property documents. The cabin was still there, or what remained of it. 4 hours northwest, deep enough into the mountains that cell service was spotty, and the nearest town was 45 minutes down a winding road. He'd told no one he was leaving. He'd packed his truck with a tent, a sleeping bag, basic tools, and enough food for a week. He'd locked the house and driven away from his suburban life with a clarity that felt almost reckless. The drive had taken him through familiar territory that became increasingly wild. Asheville fell away into smaller towns, then into nothing but forest and winding roads that climbed higher with each mile. He'd stopped once for gas and coffee, and the young clerk had looked at him with casual indifference, just another old man passing through. By the time he'd turned onto the unmarked fire road that led to the property, the sun was low and the shadows were long. The road was worse than he remembered, rutted and overgrown. Branches scraped the sides of his truck. Twice he'd almost turned back, certain he'd gotten lost, but then he'd seen the old marker, a cairn of stones his father had stacked at the property line. The clearing appeared suddenly, opening up like a wound in the forest. The cabin was barely recognizable. What had once been walls were now collapsed timbers, grey and rotting. The roof had caved in completely, leaving only the stone chimney standing like a grave marker. 40 years of weather had reclaimed most of what his father had built. Saplings grew through gaps in the foundation, vines covered everything. Mitch had sat in his truck for a long time, engine off, staring at the ruins. This was a mistake. This was insane. He was 62 years old, alone, looking at a project that would take months if it was even possible. But when he'd finally stepped out, when his boots had touched the soil his father had walked on, something settled in him. The air smelled like pine and earth. The silence was complete except for wind moving through trees. No traffic, no neighbors, no empty house waiting to remind him of everything he'd lost. He'd spent that first night in his truck, unable to make himself set up the tent in the dark. He'd eaten a cold sandwich and watched stars appear in numbers he'd forgotten existed. His phone had no signal. No one could reach him, even if they wanted to. In the morning, he'd walked the perimeter of the ruined cabin, assessing the damage with an engineer's eye. The foundation was cracked, but salvageable. Two of the original walls still had structural integrity, though barely. Most of the logs would need to be removed and replaced. It wasn't a restoration project, it was a complete rebuild. Standing there in the early light, Mitch had felt his father's presence so strongly it almost hurt. Frank Rowen had started something here and never finished it. Now his son would complete what he'd begun, not because it made sense, not because anyone asked him to, but because he needed to build something that would last. He'd unpacked his truck methodically, setting up his tent beside the ruins where the cabin would eventually stand again. He'd laid out his tools, hammer, saw, level, measuring tape, arranging them with care on a makeshift workbench made from an old door propped on sawhorses. By noon, he'd begun clearing debris, pulling away rotted wood piece by piece, revealing the bones of his father's dream underneath. The first full day of real work taught Mitch exactly how ambitious and perhaps foolish his plan truly was. He'd woken at dawn with his back already aching from sleeping on the ground. The tent offered shelter but no comfort, and at 62 his body reminded him of every year with stiff joints and protesting muscles. He'd made instant coffee over a small camp stove, watching mist rise from the valley below, and told himself the soreness would fade as he got used to the work. It didn't. By mid-morning, he'd pulled away enough debris to fully expose what remained of the cabin's structure. The assessment was worse than he'd hoped. The roof hadn't just collapsed, it had rotted from the inside out, bringing down most of the support beams with it. Water damage had spread through the walls, turning solid logs into spongy, crumbling wood that fell apart in his hands. He'd stood in what used to be the main room, looking up at open sky where a ceiling should have been, and felt the weight of what he'd committed to. This wasn't a weekend project. This wasn't even a month-long project. He was looking at a complete teardown and rebuild hundreds of hours of labor that would test every limit he had. The foundation told the worst story. His father had poured concrete footings in 1978, solid work that had lasted, but the years had opened cracks that now leaked and shifted. Frost heave had pushed sections out of alignment. If he wanted the cabin to stand for another 40 years, he'd need to repair or replace most of it. Mitch had learned structural engineering in classrooms and applied it to municipal projects, bridges that carried thousands of cars, water systems that served entire communities. But that work had always involved teams, machinery, contractors. This was just him, his hands, and whatever strength he could summon. He'd grabbed the corner beam that had once anchored the eastern wall, intending to test its integrity. The wood crumbled the moment he gripped it, dissolving into chunks of rot and sawdust that scattered across his boots. The beam had looked solid from a distance. Up close, it was nothing but decay held together by habit. Something broke in him then. He'd sat down hard on a section of foundation that still held, dropped his head into his hands, and cried for the first time since Diane had left. The tears came in waves, ugly, gasping sobs that shook his whole body. He cried for his marriage, for the silence from his children, for his father who died before finishing what he'd started. He cried for being 62 and alone in the mountains with a project that might kill him or at least break what was left of his pride. The crying lasted until it didn't. Eventually the tears stopped because there were no more to shed. He'd wiped his face with his sleeve, looked at the ruin around him, and felt something harden in his chest. He could leave, pack up the tent, drive back to Asheville, sell the property, and accept that some things were meant to stay unfinished. No one would blame him. No one would even know he'd tried. Or he could stay. The choice felt enormous and simple at the same time. His phone, lying on the workbench, showed a single bar of service. He'd picked it up and scrolled to Joanna's number. His youngest daughter, the one who'd always been hardest to reach, but also the one who, when she was small, had followed him everywhere, asking questions about how things worked. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. "Dad," her voice carried the hurried tone of someone interrupted. "I'm at work. Can this wait? I just wanted to talk for a minute," he'd said, trying to keep his voice steady. About what? Are you okay? Did something happen? I'm fine. I'm up at Grandpa Frank's old place, the cabin property. Silence on the other end, then. That old place. Why would you go there? I'm rebuilding it. The cabin. I thought maybe when it's done you all could. Dad, I really can't talk right now. I have a meeting in 5 minutes. Her impatience cut through the line like a blade. Sure, of course. I just thought, I'll call you back, okay? I promise. I have to go. The line went dead before he could say goodbye. Mitch had stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down carefully, screen side down so he wouldn't have to look at it. She'd said she'd call back. She wouldn't. They both knew it. The dismissal shouldn't have surprised him. His children had been slipping away for years, their lives full of obligations and distances that had nothing to do with geography. But hearing Joanna's voice so rushed, so uninterested, crystallized something he'd been avoiding. They didn't need him anymore. Maybe they never really had. The thought should have devastated him. Instead, it sparked something else. Anger, maybe, or just stubborn determination. He'd spent his whole life building things for other people, infrastructure they'd use without thinking about, a home his family had outgrown, a career that ended the moment he retired. Everything he'd made had been for someone else's benefit. This cabin would be different. This would be his. He'd stood up, brushed the sawdust from his jeans, and looked at the ruins with fresh eyes. Yes, it was a disaster. Yes, it would take months. Yes, he might be too old and too alone to pull it off. But he was here, and the work was in front of him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had a reason to get up in the morning. He'd picked up a pry bar and started pulling away the rotted sections systematically, stacking anything salvageable and discarding the rest. The physical labor channeled his anger and grief into something productive. Each piece of ruined wood he removed was a small victory. Each nail he pulled was progress. By late afternoon he'd cleared most of the collapsed roof debris and created a pile of timber that might still be useful. His hands were covered in splinters and blisters, his shoulders screamed with fatigue. But the site looked different, organized, purposeful. The outline of what could be was starting to emerge from what had been. As the sun dropped toward the ridgeline, Mitch discovered something that stopped him cold. Beneath a section of collapsed wall, protected by the angle of the fall, were 3 massive, hand-hewn beams his father had shaped decades ago. The wood was old-growth oak, dense and dark with age. Mitch ran his hand along the surface, feeling the marks from his father's broadaxe still visible in the grain. These beams were solid, perfect. His father's craftsmanship had outlasted everything else. Mitch had pulled them free carefully, one at a time, and carried them to his workbench. They were heavy, easily 100 pounds each, but he managed. He'd laid them out side by side, examining every inch. No rot, no serious cracks. They'd been waiting 40 years for someone to finish what Frank Rowen had started. Standing there with his father's work in front of him, Mitch made a decision. These 3 beams would form the foundation of the new cabin. Everything else he built would rise from his father's craftsmanship. It felt right. It felt like a promise being kept. That night, exhausted and aching in ways he hadn't felt in decades, Mitch sat outside his tent with a cup of instant soup and watched stars appear one by one. His phone stayed dark, no calls, no messages. The silence that had felt suffocating in his suburban house felt different here. Cleaner, honest. Tomorrow he'd start the real work. He'd begin laying the foundation properly, setting those 3 beams as cornerstones. He'd build something that would last, something his father would recognize, something that proved he was still capable of making things that mattered. The ruins were still ruins, but they wouldn't stay that way. By the end of the first week, Mitch had established a rhythm that his body grudgingly accepted. Wake at first light, instant coffee and oatmeal. Work until the sun climbed high enough to make him strip down to a t-shirt. Break for lunch, usually a sandwich eaten standing up. Work until his hands started shaking from fatigue. Dinner from a can. Sleep hard in the tent, despite the unforgiving ground. The routine saved him from thinking too much. Thinking led to dwelling, and dwelling led nowhere productive. Better to focus on the work in front of him, measuring, cutting, lifting, fitting. His body protested every morning, muscles he'd forgotten about announcing themselves with sharp complaints. But after an hour of movement, the stiffness would ease into a dull ache he could work through. He learned to pace himself. At 62, he couldn't throw himself at the labor the way he might have at 30. He had to think strategically, plan each task to minimize wasted motion, use leverage instead of brute strength. When he needed to move something heavy, he'd rig a simple pulley system. When his back started to seize, he'd stop and stretch, no matter how much he wanted to push through. The foundation work consumed those first 2 weeks. He'd rented a concrete mixer from a supplier in Ridgemont, the nearest town, 45 minutes down the mountain. The drive became familiar steep switchbacks, giving way to gentler curves, forest opening up to reveal a small community tucked into the valley. Ridgemont had maybe 3,000 people, a main street with the essentials, and the kind of quiet that came from being far enough from anything important. The hardware store sat on the corner of Main and Oak, a brick building that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. Inside, the narrow aisles were packed with everything from lumber to plumbing supplies to bird seed. The smell of sawdust and machine oil reminded Mitch of his father's workshop. Vernon Pike ran the place. He was somewhere in his mid-70s, rail-thin with hands like gnarled tree roots and eyes that missed nothing. The first time Mitch had come in asking about concrete mix and rebar, Vernon had looked him over carefully. "You're building something serious," Vernon had said. "Not a question. Rebuilding, actually." Old cabin up past the Fire Road junction. Vernon's expression had shifted recognition, maybe curiosity. "How far up?" "About 8 miles. My father started it back in 78. Frank Rowan's place." Vernon had nodded slowly. "Heard he never finished it." "You, his boy?" "Yes, sir." "Mitch Rowen." Vernon had extended a hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that twisted his fingers. "Your daddy was a good man, bought a lot of materials from my father back when he ran this place. Always paid cash, always knew what he needed." He'd paused, studying Mitch with an intensity that felt like being measured. "That's a hell of a project for one man." "It's what I've got," Mitch had said simply. Vernon had helped him load the concrete mixer into the truck bed, moving with the efficient economy of someone who'd done physical work his whole life. "You need advice. You come ask. I've built enough to know what works up in those mountains." The kindness, casual and unforced, had caught Mitch off guard. He'd thanked Vernon and driven back up the mountain feeling less alone than he had in months. The foundation repair took longer than Mitch had planned. He had to excavate sections where the frost heave had done the worst damage, dig down to stable soil, and pour new footings. The work was back-breaking, shoveling, mixing concrete in small batches, pouring, smoothing, waiting for it to cure before moving to the next section. His father's 3 salvaged beams sat waiting, and Mitch had promised himself he wouldn't start the framing until the foundation was absolutely right. By the second week, he'd fallen into a deeper rhythm with the place itself. He learned when the afternoon thunderstorms would roll in, usually around 3, building from nothing into drenching downpours that lasted 20 minutes before clearing. He learned which trees the birds preferred at dawn. He learned that the best time to work was early morning and late evening, when the sun wasn't so brutal. The solitude that had felt oppressive in his suburban house felt different here. There was something clean about it, honest. No one expected anything from him. No one's disappointment hung in the air like stale smoke. He could work until his hands bled, and no one would tell him to stop. He could cry or rage or sit in silence, and the mountains absorbed it all without judgment. He thought about Diane more than he wanted to admit. At night especially, When the work was done, and there was nothing to distract him from the thoughts that circled like vultures, he'd replay conversations from years ago, looking for the moment when things had started to break. Had it been when Kyle left for college? When he'd taken on that big project that kept him working 60-hour weeks? When he'd stopped asking how her day was because he assumed he already knew? The not knowing was the worst part. She'd left without explanation, and his imagination filled the void with every possible failure he could have committed. One afternoon, while waiting for a section of concrete to cure, Mitch had found himself digging through the ruins more carefully, looking for anything his father might have left behind. He'd found mostly garbage, rusted nails, rotted fabric, broken glass. But wrapped in an old tarp beneath what used to be the workbench, he'd discovered his father's hand plane. The tool was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, rosewood body, brass fittings, the blade still sharp after 4 decades wrapped in oilcloth. Mitch had lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it, the way it fit his palm exactly as it must have fit his father's. He'd carried it to his workbench and spent an hour cleaning it, working oil into the wood, sharpening the blade until it could shave paper. That night, he'd used it to smooth one of the salvaged beams, just to feel the connection. The plane had glided across the oak, peeling away thin curls of wood that fell like ribbons. His father had held this same tool, had shaped these same beams. The continuity of it, the sense that he was completing something rather than starting from scratch, steadied something in Mitch's chest. By the end of the second week, the foundation was complete, level and true, cured and solid. Mitch had stood back and surveyed it with an engineer's critical eye, looking for flaws. There were none. It was good work, work that would last. He'd placed his father's 3 beams at the corners and center point, exactly where they'd bear the most weight. They looked right there, ancient and solid, connecting what Frank had started to what Mitch would finish. That evening, he'd driven back to Ridgemont for supplies, lumber for the framing, more nails, a box of screws, new saw blades. At the hardware store, Vernon had helped him load everything, then stopped him before he left. "You're doing good work up there," Vernon had said. "I can tell by what you're buying. Taking your time, doing it right." "Trying to," Mitch had replied. "That's all any of us can do." Vernon had clapped him on the shoulder. "Your daddy would be proud." The words had stayed with Mitch all the way up the mountain, warming something he hadn't realized was cold. The third week brought the kind of satisfaction that comes from visible progress. With the foundation complete and his father's 3 beams positioned as cornerstones, Mitch began raising the frame walls. The work required precision, measuring twice, cutting once, checking level, and plumb at every stage. A mistake now would compound itself through the entire structure. He'd learned carpentry as a boy, standing beside his father in the garage workshop, learning to read a tape measure and swing a hammer. But that had been 45 years ago, and the skills had gone rusty with disuse. His career in civil engineering had been about calculations and oversight, not hands-on building. Now he had to remember lessons half forgotten, relearn through trial and error. The first wall section took him 2 full days. He'd cut the studs to length, assembled the frame flat on the ground, checked every angle with his square, then wrestled it upright and braced it in place. The moment when it stood vertical, solid and true, had filled him with a pride he hadn't felt in years. This was real. This was happening. By the end of the week, 2 walls stood perpendicular to each other, framed and braced. The cabin was beginning to take shape, rising from the foundation like something being remembered into existence. On Saturday morning, Mitch was cutting lumber when he heard voices approaching through the trees. He looked up to see 2 hikers emerging onto the clearing, a couple in their 40s, wearing expensive gear and carrying hiking poles. They stopped when they saw him, clearly surprised to find someone this far off the main trails. "Sorry," the man called out. "We didn't realize this was private property." "It is, but you're welcome to look around," Mitch said, setting down his saw. "Just passing through." The woman was staring at the cabin frame. "Are you building this yourself?" "Rebuilding it. Yes, ma'am." They walked closer, the woman circling the structure with open curiosity. "This is incredible. How long have you been working on it?" "3 weeks." "Alone?" The man looked skeptical. "No crew?" "Just me." They peppered him with questions: what made him decide to do this, how much experience he had, how long he thought it would take. Mitch answered briefly, unused to conversation after days of solitude. The attention made him self-conscious, aware of how he must look unshaven, clothes covered in sawdust, hands calloused and cut. Before they left, the woman pulled out her phone and took a photo. "This is inspiring," she said. "Mind if I share it? I won't include your location or anything identifying." Mitch had shrugged. "Do what you like." After they'd disappeared back into the trees, he'd returned to work, feeling strange. The encounter had reminded him that the world beyond the clearing still existed, people with jobs and social media accounts and Saturday plans. He'd been so immersed in the work that everything else had faded to background noise. The next phase required windows. He'd sketched rough plans for their placement, wanting to maximize light while maintaining structural integrity. 4 windows, total 2 facing the valley view, 1 on each end wall. He'd ordered them from a supplier in Asheville, simple double-hung units, and driven down to pick them up himself. The trip to Asheville had felt disorienting. Traffic and strip malls and crowds of people living their normal lives. He'd moved through it all feeling like a ghost, no longer part of that world. His house, his and Diane's house, was only 15 minutes from the supplier, but he hadn't gone near it, couldn't. The thought of walking into those empty rooms made his chest tighten. Back at the cabin, he'd spent 2 days framing the window openings, getting the measurements exact. A window installed crooked would haunt him forever. But the work went smoothly, and by Thursday evening, all 4 frames were complete, ready for the actual windows to be installed. That night, a storm rolled in, harder than usual. The afternoon thunder showers he'd gotten used to were nothing compared to this, a true mountain storm with wind that bent trees and rain that fell in sheets. His tent shuddered and leaked, water pooling beneath his sleeping bag. He'd spent a miserable night huddled in his truck, listening to the storm tear at his worksite. Morning revealed the damage. 1 section of wall frame had been knocked askew by the wind. His tarp-covered lumber pile had scattered across the clearing. Smaller tools he'd left out were buried in mud. The careful organization he'd maintained was chaos. Mitch had sat in the truck cab, engine running for heat, and felt something close to despair. The work was hard enough when everything went right. Setbacks like this could break his momentum, send him spiraling into questions about whether any of this made sense. His phone, lying on the passenger seat, buzzed, a rare event this far up the mountain. A text from Kyle. "Mum called. She's worried about you. Are you okay?" So Diane knew where he was. Somehow that surprised him. He'd assumed she'd cut all ties, stopped caring about his whereabouts, but she'd reached out to Kyle, which meant she was still paying attention, even if at a distance. He typed back, "I'm fine. Working on something important." The response came quickly. "Whatever, Dad. Just don't do anything stupid." The dismissiveness stung worse than concern would have. Kyle couldn't even pretend to care about what his father was doing. The message was clear: don't cause problems, don't make us worry, don't be a burden. Mitch had stared at those words for a long time. Then he deleted the conversation, pocketed his phone, and climbed out of the truck. The wall section that had been knocked crooked wasn't destroyed, just displaced. He could fix it. The scattered lumber could be restacked, the tools could be cleaned. Nothing was actually broken beyond repair. It was just work, more work, harder work, but still work. He'd spent the day salvaging what he could, repositioning the wall frame, reinforcing the bracing so the wind couldn't knock it loose again. By evening, things looked organized again. Not perfect, but functional. The setback had taught him something. He couldn't control the weather, couldn't prevent every problem. But he could respond, could adapt, could keep moving forward even when circumstances knocked him sideways. It was a lesson he should have learned years ago about his marriage, about his children, about life in general. That weekend, he installed the first two windows, the ones facing the valley. They went in cleanly, fitting the frames exactly. When he stepped back and saw actual glass where there had been only rough openings, something shifted. The structure wasn't just a frame anymore. It was becoming a cabin again, something that could shelter someone from the weather. He hung his father's compass from a nail beside the first window, small, rusted, but the needle still pointed true north. It felt like the right first decoration, a reminder that even when everything else was uncertain, some things remained constant. 1 month into the project, Mitch had become a regular fixture in Ridgemont. The drives down the mountain for supplies had evolved from necessary errands into something almost social. Vernon at the hardware store greeted him by name now, often had materials ready before Mitch even asked. The woman who ran the diner, Ruth, 60-something with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, had started packing extra sandwiches when she saw him come in. "You're too skinny, Mitch," she'd said the first time, sliding a paper bag across the counter. "Take this for later." No charge. He'd tried to protest, but she'd waved him off. "My husband was a builder, worked himself half to death on projects. Someone should have made sure he ate properly." The kindness of strangers had become its own kind of sustenance. These people didn't know his history, didn't carry expectations or disappointments. They saw what he was doing and respected it. That simple recognition meant more than Mitch could articulate. The cabin now had walls and windows. The roof trusses were going up, a geometric puzzle of angles and joists that required careful calculation. Mitch worked slowly, double-checking his math, knowing that errors in the roof structure would be catastrophic. Too shallow and snow would accumulate dangerously. Too steep and the whole thing could be top-heavy in wind. One afternoon, while taking a water break, he'd noticed something wedged beneath a rotted floorboard he was prying up. A metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, surface pitted with rust but still intact. His heart had quickened as he worked it free. Inside, wrapped in layers of deteriorating plastic, were his father's original blueprints. Water-stained and fragile, the pages had survived 4 decades through sheer luck. Mitch had spread them carefully on his workbench, weighting the corners with stones, and studied what Frank Rowen had actually planned. The design was more ambitious than Mitch had remembered. His father hadn't just envisioned a simple 2-room cabin. The blueprints showed a loft space, accessed by a ladder, that could sleep 4. A stone fireplace, tall enough to draw properly. A wraparound porch with carved railings. Details that spoke of permanence, of a place meant to gather family for generations. Mitch had traced the lines with his finger, seeing his father's handwriting in the margin notes. Good southern exposure for winter sun. Stone must be local Check Creek bed. Porch deep enough for rocking chairs. Frank had dreamed bigger than what his illness had allowed him to finish. Now his son could complete that vision properly. The decision to expand his plans came easily. He'd already committed months to this project. What was a few more to honor his father's full design? The loft would require more lumber, more time framing. The fireplace would need stone, hundreds of pounds of it, selected and fit carefully. The porch would come last, but he could prep for it now. He'd driven back to Ridgemont the next day and ordered materials for the expanded plan. Vernon had looked over the updated list and whistled low. "You're really going all in," Vernon had said. "Might as well do it right." "Your father's plans? How did you know?" Vernon had tapped the blueprint Mitch had brought for reference. "Recognize his handwriting. He showed these to my father back in the day. Always wondered if anyone would finish what he started." The expanded scope meant Mitch would be working well into fall, possibly winter. He'd need to think about cold weather construction, about how to work when snow came. But the idea of rushing to finish now felt wrong. This cabin deserved to be built according to Frank's vision, not some compromised version. As he worked that week, Mitch found himself thinking more about his marriage. not with the raw pain of the first weeks, but with a clarity distance had provided. He'd been going through the motions for years, comfortable but disconnected, present but not really there. When had he stopped asking Diane about her dreams? When had he stopped listening? He remembered an argument they'd had maybe 2 years ago. She'd wanted to take a painting class, something structured with an instructor. He'd said it was expensive, questioned whether she'd stick with it. She'd signed up anyway but never mentioned it again. Had she gone? Had she quit? He honestly didn't know. He'd been too wrapped up in his own routine to pay attention. The pattern repeated across dozens of small moments, her suggesting they go hiking, him saying maybe later, her asking if they should plan a trip, him putting it off because of work. Her excitement about something she'd read or seen, him offering distracted acknowledgement while watching television. Death by 1,000 small dismissals, not dramatic enough to fight about, but corrosive over time. And his children, when had he stopped being someone they wanted to talk to? Kyle had tried, early on, to share details about his work in IT. Mitch had nodded and smiled, but couldn't follow the technical jargon, had never bothered to learn. Eventually Kyle had stopped trying. Brenna had invited him to her classroom events, proud to show off her teaching. He'd attended once or twice, then begged off, citing work obligations that probably hadn't been as urgent as he'd claimed. Joanna had always been the most distant, but he'd never fought to close that gap, assuming she'd come around eventually. They'd all drifted, because he'd let them. Because he'd been comfortable in his own routine and hadn't noticed the emptiness growing around him. The realization didn't come as a shock, more like something he'd always known but refused to acknowledge. Out here, alone with nothing but work and silence, he couldn't avoid it anymore. One evening, his phone actually had signal. 3 texts from Brenna, sent hours apart. "Dad, Kyle told me where you are. Are you really building a cabin? I'm worried about you. This seems crazy. Can you at least let me know you're okay?" He'd stared at the messages for a long time before responding. "I'm okay. Better than I've been in a while, actually. The cabin is coming along. I'll send pictures when I can." Her reply came quickly. "I don't understand why you're doing this." He'd typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "I needed to build something that mattered, something I could finish." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Okay, just be careful and call if you need anything." It wasn't understanding, but it was contact. More than he'd had in months. That night, lying in his tent with the sound of wind in the pines, Mitch felt something shift. The cabin was taking shape, solid and real. His body was stronger despite the constant ache. And maybe, if he could prove he was capable of finishing what his father started, his children might see him differently. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe this was just for him proof to himself that he could still build something lasting. Either way, the work continued. 6 weeks into the project, the cabin had a roof. Mitch stood in the clearing at dusk, looking at the structure silhouetted against the fading light, and felt something close to awe. The building was weatherproof. Now walls, windows, and a solid roof that would shed rain and snow. For the first time since he'd arrived, he could move out of the tent and sleep inside what he'd built with his own hands. The emotional weight of that transition surprised him. He'd spent over a month sleeping on the ground, waking stiff and cold most mornings, but the tent had been temporary by nature. Moving inside meant committing to this place, claiming it as shelter rather than just a work site. That first night indoors, he'd laid his sleeping bag on the plywood subfloor and stared up at the exposed roof beams. No insulation yet, no finished ceiling, but overhead was solid. Protected, the wind that had tormented his tent now passed harmlessly above. Rain that had soaked him pattered against shingles. He'd nailed himself. He'd built this. Every board, every nail, every decision about placement and angle. The satisfaction ran deeper than anything he'd felt designing municipal infrastructure. Those projects had been collaborations, his work diluted among committees and contractors. This was purely his, marked by his choices and mistakes and persistence. The work shifted to interior systems. He'd planned to keep things simple, no running water initially, though he'd roughed in plumbing for future installation, solar panels for basic electricity, enough to power lights and charge his phone, a wood-burning stove for heat rather than propane or electric. The goal was functionality, not luxury. Vernon had introduced him to Hugh Brennan, a retired electrician who lived on the outskirts of Ridgemont. Hugh was probably 70, still sharp-eyed and precise in his explanations. He'd driven up to the cabin one Saturday, looked over Mitch's rough wiring plans, and offered corrections that would keep the whole thing from burning down. "You're doing good work here," Hugh had said, walking the perimeter of the interior. "Most men wouldn't attempt this alone. Takes guts." "Or stupidity," Mitch had replied. "Sometimes those are the same thing," Hugh had grinned. "But you're being smart about it, taking your time, doing it proper. That matters more than speed." The validation from men like Vernon and Hugh meant something Mitch hadn't expected to need. They were builders, makers, men who understood that creating something with your hands was its own form of conversation. They looked at his work and saw competence, saw respect for craft. Their approval filled a space his children's indifference had hollowed out. The fireplace became his next focus. His father's plans called for riverstone, fitted without mortar in the traditional style, with a firebox built from firebrick. Mitch had walked the creek that ran through his property, selecting stones for size and shape, hauling them back in a wheelbarrow load by load. The work was meditative, examining each stone, imagining where it would fit in the overall pattern. Building the fireplace required different skills than framing. Each stone had to be positioned to lock with its neighbors, weight distributed properly, gaps minimized without relying on mortar to hold everything together. It was puzzle work, trial and error, placing a stone only to remove it and try another. The process was slow. Some days he'd place only a dozen stones, building up the structure inch by inch, but watching it rise solid, permanent, beautiful in its rough functionality gave him a sense of accomplishment unlike any other part of the project. While he worked, his mind wandered through memories. One kept surfacing, a summer afternoon when he was maybe 14, working beside his father on this very property. They'd been clearing brush, sweating in the heat, when Frank had stopped and pointed down at the valley. "You see that, Mitch? We're building something that'll be here long after we're gone. Your grandkids might sit in this cabin someday, looking at that same view. That's what makes the work worth doing." At the time, Mitch had been more interested in finishing so they could go swimming in the creek. But now, 48 years later, he understood what his father had meant. Legacy wasn't about being remembered, it was about creating something that outlasted you, something that could serve purposes you'd never see. His own children might never appreciate this cabin. They might visit once out of obligation, take a few photos, and never return. That was their choice. But the building would still be here, solid and real, proof that Mitch Rowen had finished what Frank Rowen started. One afternoon, while he was mixing mortar for the firebox, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Brenner. He'd wiped his hands on his jeans and answered, "Hey, sweetheart." "Dad." Her voice sounded different, softer, less hurried than usual. "How are you?" "Really? I'm good. Dirty and tired, but good. Kyle showed me the photo those hikers posted. The one with you and the cabin. It's been shared like crazy on some homesteading groups." Mitch had no idea what she was talking about. "What photo?" "Someone took a picture of you working and posted it online. It's kind of gone viral. Man rebuilds father's abandoned cabin alone in the mountains. People are really inspired by it." The idea made him uncomfortable. "I didn't know anyone took pictures except those first hikers." "Well, they did. And now thousands of people are following your story. There are comments from all over, people saying they needed to see this, that it gave them courage to start their own projects." She paused. "Dad, what you're doing is really impressive." The words caught him off guard. Brenna had always been the gentlest of his children, but she'd still kept her distance. Hearing genuine admiration in her voice now felt like water after a drought. "I'm just finishing what your grandfather started," he managed. "No, you're doing more than that. You're showing up for yourself. That takes strength." They talked for 20 minutes, really talked, not the surface-level exchanges that had defined their relationship for years. She told him about her classroom, about a student who reminded her of herself at that age. He told her about finding his father's blueprints, about deciding to honor the full vision. Before she hung up, she said something that stayed with him. "I think I understand now why you had to do this. Sometimes you need to build something to remember who you are." After the call ended, Mitch had sat on the unfinished porch, just boards nailed to joists, no railing yet, and felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe his children were paying attention after all. Maybe distance had given them perspective he'd lacked when they all lived within shouting distance. He'd pulled out the yellowed family photograph he'd found with the blueprints. His father, his mother, himself at 14, all of them young and smiling, working together on this dream. The image was faded, colors shifted toward sepia, but the joy in their faces was clear. That unity had existed once. Maybe it could exist again, in a different form. 2 months into the project, the cabin stood essentially complete. The exterior was weatherproofed, windows installed and trimmed, the roof solid overhead. Inside, the fireplace rose magnificently, stones fitted so precisely they seemed to have grown into place rather than been positioned by hand. The loft framing was complete, accessible by a sturdy ladder Mitch had built from oak. Solar panels on the south-facing roof provided enough power for basic needs. He was staining the exterior cedar when he heard a vehicle approaching. The sound was distinctive enough that he set down his brush and walked to the clearing's edge. A blue pickup truck emerged from the tree-lined newer model, clean despite the rough road. Not a vehicle he recognized. The driver's door opened, and Kyle stepped out. Mitch's heart did something complicated, a combination of leap and lurch. His oldest son, who he hadn't seen in over a year, standing 30 feet away, looking uncomfortable and determined in equal measure. "Kyle!" Mitch's voice came out rougher than intended. "Dad." Kyle wouldn't meet his eyes, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "Mom asked me to bring you something." The mention of Diane stopped whatever greeting Mitch had been forming. Kyle reached into the truck and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with what looked like multiple pages inside. "She wanted you to have this." Kyle walked forward, extending the envelope like it might burn him. "I need to get back. Long drive. You drove 4 hours to deliver a letter." Mitch took the envelope, feeling its weight. "Mom said it was important, that you deserved an explanation." Kyle finally looked at him, and Mitch saw something in his son's expression, not anger exactly, but a kind of exhausted frustration. "Just read it, okay? She spent a long time writing it. Will you stay? I could make coffee, show you what I've built." "I can't. I told work I'd only be gone a few hours." Kyle glanced at the cabin, his expression unreadable. "It looks good, though. Really good. I didn't think you'd actually finish it." The words stung more than if Kyle had said nothing. The assumption that his father would fail, would give up, had been baked into his son's expectations. "I'll call you after I read this," Mitch said, lifting the envelope slightly. Kyle nodded, already backing toward his truck. "Sure. Yeah. Take care of yourself, Dad." Then he was gone, truck bouncing back down the fire road, leaving Mitch standing in the clearing with an envelope that felt heavier than paper should. He didn't open it immediately. Couldn't. The work called to him, staining, half-finished, tools to clean, always something to do. But the envelope sat on his makeshift table inside, drawing his attention like a wound he couldn't stop probing. Finally, as the sun dropped toward the ridgeline, he sat on the porch steps and opened it. 6 pages in Diane's precise handwriting, dated 8 weeks ago, right around the time he'd first arrived at the cabin. "Dear Mitch," it began, I've started this letter 100 times and never found the right words. Maybe there aren't right words for what I need to say. I'm going to try anyway, because you deserve an explanation, even if I didn't give you one when I left." The letter unfolded like a map of a marriage he'd thought he knew but had actually been blind to. Diane wrote about years of feeling invisible, of conversations where he'd nodded but never really heard her. She described depression that had crept over her so gradually she hadn't recognized it until she was drowning. Therapy sessions she'd attended alone, because asking him to come would have required admitting something was wrong, and she couldn't bear the thought of him dismissing her concerns the way he'd dismissed so many smaller things. "I tried to tell you," she wrote. "Not directly, I couldn't find those words either, but in smaller ways. I suggested we travel," you said later. "I asked if you'd come to the art exhibit with me. You had work. I cooked dinners that got cold while you watched television. Each time felt small, not worth fighting about. But they accumulated like snow, and eventually I was buried under years of not mattering enough." The words cut deep because they were true. Mitch could see it now, the pattern of casual dismissals, the way he'd prioritized his own comfort over her needs, the assumption that because she didn't complain loudly, everything was fine. "Leaving wasn't sudden," Diane continued. "I'd been leaving for 2 years, piece by piece, until there wasn't enough of me left to stay. I'm sorry I couldn't say this to your face. I'm sorry I just disappeared. But I had no words left, and I was afraid if I tried to explain, you'd convince me to stay, and I'd lose myself completely." She wrote about where she was now staying with her sister in Portland, seeing a therapist twice a week, painting every day. She was rebuilding herself the way he was rebuilding the cabin. She didn't hate him. She didn't want him to suffer. She just needed to exist as something other than his wife, his children's mother, roles that had consumed her until there was nothing else left. "I heard you're building something in the mountains," the letter concluded. "Kyle told me, reluctantly. I'm glad. You needed a purpose beyond us. Maybe we both needed to remember who we were before we became we. I hope you find what you're looking for up there. I hope you finish what your father started. And I hope someday you can forgive me for leaving the way I did. I hope I can forgive myself. Take care, Mitch. You deserve to be happy. We both do." He read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of pain he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. His entire narrative had been wrong. He wasn't the victim of sudden abandonment. He'd been a participant in a slow dissolution he'd refused to see. The realization was crushing. All his anger, his sense of betrayal, his wounded pride, none of it had been justified. Diane had tried. She'd reached out in the ways she could manage, and he'd been too comfortable, too certain of their stability, to notice she was drowning. Night fell completely. Mitch sat on the porch in darkness, the letter still in his hands, and grieved differently than he had before. Not for what was taken from him, but for what he'd failed to protect. For the woman who'd loved him enough to spend 2 years trying before she finally gave up. The cabin behind him was solid and real, but it couldn't fix what was truly broken. Morning came with unusual clarity. Mitch woke on the floor of the cabin. He'd fallen asleep there after reading Diane's letter, too exhausted to move to his sleeping bag. His back protested the hard surface, but his mind felt strangely clear, stripped of the defensive narratives he'd been carrying. He couldn't fix the past, couldn't undo years of inattention and comfortable neglect. But he could finish what he'd started here, and maybe, just maybe, that would demonstrate something his words never could. That he was capable of seeing a commitment through, that he could change. The cabin was nearly complete, but nearly wasn't good enough. If this was going to mean something, it needed to be finished properly, with the care and attention he should have given his marriage. He made coffee on the camp stove and assessed what remained. The interior needed finishing trim work around windows and doors, sanding and sealing the plywood floors, installing the wood-burning stove he'd bought but not yet connected. The porch was framed but lacked railings and steps, small details that would transform the structure from functional to welcoming. He started with the porch railings. His father's blueprints showed a simple design, squared posts with horizontal rails, nothing fancy but solid. Mitch cut the lumber carefully, measured twice for each piece, fitted everything together with the precision he'd learned to value over the past 2 months. While he worked, he composed a response to Diane in his head, not excuses or justifications, but acknowledgement. She'd been honest about her pain. He owed her the same honesty about his failures. That afternoon, he walked down to where his truck was parked and drove to Ridgemont. At the post office, he bought paper and an envelope, then sat in his truck and wrote, "Diane, thank you for your letter. Thank you for your honesty. You're right about all of it. I didn't listen. I didn't see you disappearing because I wasn't paying attention. I got comfortable and lazy and assumed you'd always be there. I'm sorry. Those words aren't enough, but they're true. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking for anything except your forgiveness when you're ready to give it. I hope Portland is good to you. I hope you're finding yourself again. You deserve that. You always did. I'm finishing the cabin. It's taught me more than I expected about commitment and patience and actually showing up for what matters. I wish I'd learned these lessons 30 years ago. Take care of yourself. Mitch." He mailed it before he could second-guess the words, then drove back up the mountain. Over the next week, he threw himself into the finishing work with renewed focus. He sent texts to his children, not asking for anything, just letting them know he was thinking of them. To Kyle, "Proud of the work you do, even if I never understood it properly." To Brenna, "Your students are lucky to have you." To Joanna, "I'm sorry I wasn't the father you needed. I'm trying to learn." The responses came slowly. Joanna didn't reply at all. Kyle sent back a brief "thanks," but Brenna called. "Dad, what's going on? Your text was, 'I don't know,' different." "I'm trying to be honest," he said, "about my failures, about what I should have done better. You're scaring me a little. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Just seeing things more clearly." He paused. "When the cabin's finished, would you come see it?" Silence on the other end, then, "Okay, yes. When it's done, I'll come." It was more than he'd hoped for. He carved a welcome sign from a piece of reclaimed oak, taking his time with each letter, making it beautiful. The sign would hang above the door, a statement of intention. This place wasn't just shelter. It was meant to gather people, to create space for connection. Vernon and Ruth visited on a Saturday, bringing Hugh along. They'd heard through the small-town network that the cabin was nearly complete and wanted to see the finished product. Mitch gave them the tour, showing the stone fireplace, the loft space, the careful joinery in the window trim. "Your old man would be proud," Vernon said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't usually show. "Real proud, Mitch." Ruth hugged him, which surprised them both. "You did something special here, something that matters." They sat on the porch, now complete with railings and 3 handmade rocking chairs Mitch had built and shared sandwiches Ruth had brought. Hugh told stories about building his own house 40 years ago, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons learned. Vernon talked about his father's hardware store, how the building craft had changed over the decades, but the fundamentals remained the same. For the first time in months, Mitch felt part of something larger than his own isolation. These people had welcomed him, supported him, celebrated his work without asking for anything in return. The kindness of near strangers had sustained him when his family couldn't. After they left, Mitch sat alone on the porch and did something impulsive. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the cabin, the first he'd taken himself. The evening light caught the fresh cedar siding, made the windows glow warmly. He posted it to social media for the first time in years. Built by hand. Took 10 weeks. Never too late to finish what was started. He didn't expect much, just a personal marker, proof of completion. But within an hour, comments and shares started flooding in. People he'd never met, responding with encouragement, sharing their own stories of projects started and finished, expressing how his work had inspired them. By the next morning, a local news outlet had messaged asking for an interview. By afternoon, a regional magazine wanted to feature the story. Strangers began showing up, hikers who detoured specifically to see the cabin, photographers asking permission to document it. The attention made Mitch uncomfortable, but it also brought something unexpected. His phone rang, Brenna calling with excitement in her voice. "Dad, I'm seeing your cabin everywhere online. Kyle sent me the article. Joanna saw it too. We want to come see it, all of us, this weekend, if that's okay." Mitch's throat tightened. "All three of you?" "Yes. We think it's time." Saturday arrived with weather that seemed designed for reconciliation. Clear skies, autumn warmth tempered by mountain breeze, leaves just beginning their seasonal turn. Mitch woke before dawn, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his wedding day. His children were coming, all three of them, together, for the first time in over 3 years. He cleaned the cabin obsessively, sweeping sawdust that didn't exist, straightening tools already organized. He'd bought real food from Ridgemont Sandwich Fixings, fresh fruit, cookies from Ruth's Diner. The wood-burning stove was ready, firewood stacked beside it, everything prepared as if proper hospitality could bridge years of distance. Brenna arrived first, mid-morning, driving a small sedan that looked out of place on the rough fire road. Mitch walked to meet her as she parked, and for a moment they just stood there, uncertain. Then she smiled genuine, reaching her eyes, and closed the distance to hug him. He held her carefully, aware of how fragile this moment felt. "Dad, this place." She turned to look at the cabin, taking it in fully. "I can't believe you built this. Come see inside." He gave her the tour, explaining each choice, each piece of salvaged material that connected to his father's original work. She touched the stone fireplace with reverence, ran her hand along the window trim, climbed the ladder to peek into the loft. "This is really something," she said, coming back down. "I didn't think you could." She stopped, seeming to catch herself. "Didn't think I could finish it?" She looked embarrassed. "We all kind of expected you'd give up after a few weeks, come home, go back to normal. I almost did. That first week especially." He gestured to the porch. "Let's sit. Your brother and sister should be here soon." They sat in 2 of the rocking chairs and for a few minutes just rocked in comfortable silence. Then Brenna spoke, her voice soft. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot, about what happened." She glanced at him. "Kyle told me she sent you a letter." "She did. It helped me understand things I should have seen years ago." "Like what?" "Like how I stopped paying attention. To her, to you kids. I got comfortable and assumed that was enough." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Your mother tried to tell me she was struggling. I didn't listen." Brenna was quiet for a moment. "I watched her disappear, Dad. Watched her get smaller and quieter. I didn't know how to help. I was angry at both of you, at her for leaving, at you for not fighting to make her stay. She needed to leave. I see that now. I'm scared. I'm becoming like her," Brenna admitted. "In my relationship, I feel myself getting quieter, making myself smaller so there's room for him. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I've disappeared." Mitch reached over and took her hand. "Then don't. Speak up now. Make him listen. Don't do what your mother and I did, waiting until silence becomes permanent." Before she could respond, they heard vehicles approaching. 2 this time, Kyle's blue pickup and a white SUV that must be Joanna's. The reunions were awkward at first. Kyle nodded stiffly, shook his father's hand like they were business associates. Joanna hung back, arms crossed, defensive posture clear. But Brenna broke the tension by pulling them both toward the cabin. "You have to see what Dad built. It's incredible." Mitch gave the tour again. Aware of Kyle's analytical gaze, assessing every detail, Joanna's skeptical silence. They examined the fireplace, tested the ladder to the loft, looked out the windows at the valley view. "This is what you've been doing?" Joanna finally spoke, her tone sharp with something between admiration and accusation. "Building a cabin? While we—" She didn't finish, but the implication was clear. "While we worried, while we tried to make sense of our family falling apart, while we dealt with everything you left behind." "Yes," Mitch said simply. "This is what I've been doing." "Why?" She turned to face him fully. "Why couldn't you fight for us like this? Why couldn't you put this kind of effort into keeping our family together?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and entirely fair. "You're right," Mitch said. "I should have. I didn't know how. I didn't even realize I needed to until it was too late." He gestured around the cabin. This was me learning how to commit to something, how to show up every day even when it's hard. I wish I'd learned it 30 years ago." Kyle finally spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "We all saw it happening, Dad. You and Mom drifting. We didn't know what to do. Felt like you didn't need us anymore. Like you were done." The pain in his son's voice cracked something in Mitch's chest. "I was lost. After retirement, I didn't know who I was without work. I made you all invisible because I couldn't see past my own confusion." "That's not good enough," Joanna said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. "No, it's not, but it's honest." Mitch met her eyes. "I failed you. All of you. I failed your mother. I can't undo that. I can only tell you I'm sorry, and hope that someday you can forgive me." The silence that followed felt different, not hostile, but processing. Ruth appeared then, as if summoned by some sixth sense, carrying containers of food and her warm, no-nonsense presence. "Figured you could all use lunch," she said, setting everything on the makeshift porch table. "I'm Ruth. Your father's been keeping me informed about you three. Good to finally meet you." Her casual intrusion broke the tension. They ate together on the porch, awkward but less hostile. Conversation stayed surface level at first, but gradually deepened. Kyle talked about his work, and this time Mitch asked real questions, tried to understand. Brenna shared stories from her classroom. Even Joanna softened slightly, mentioning her job in Atlanta. As afternoon light slanted through the trees, Kyle pulled out his phone. "We should take a picture, for the record." They gathered on the porch, steps Mitch in the middle, his three children flanking him. Kyle set the timer and joined them, and for one moment they looked like a family again. The photograph Kyle took sat on his phone screen as they looked at it together, four people on a porch, tentative smiles, the cabin solid behind them. It wasn't a perfect family portrait. The stiffness in their postures, the careful distance between bodies, told the truth of where they actually were. But it was honest, and that mattered more than perfection. "Can you send that to me?" Brenna asked. Kyle nodded, tapping his screen. "Sending to everyone." Joanna studied the image on her own phone, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at the cabin, really examining it for the first time since she'd arrived. "How long did this take you?" she asked. 2.5 months. Working alone, every day. That's—" She paused, searching for words. "That's commitment. It's what was needed." She walked to the door, touched the welcome sign he'd carved. "You made this?" "Yes. It's beautiful." Her voice caught slightly. "I didn't know you could do things like this." "Neither did I, honestly." Mitch joined her at the door. "Turns out I'd forgotten a lot of what my father taught me. Or maybe I just never appreciated it until now." Joanna turned to face him, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I've been so angry at you, at both of you, you and Mom, for not fighting harder, for just giving up. Your mother didn't give up. She fought for 2 years in ways I was too blind to see. And I didn't fight because I didn't realize there was a battle happening." He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't worth fighting for. You were. You are. I just didn't know how. The tears spilled over then. Joanna wiped at them angrily, but didn't pull away when Mitch drew her into a hug. She stood rigid for a moment, then softened, her forehead pressing against his shoulder the way it had when she was small. Kyle and Brenna pretended not to notice, giving them privacy by examining the fireplace with exaggerated interest, but Mitch saw Kyle's eyes were wet too. When Joanna pulled back, she managed a shaky laugh. I wasn't planning on crying today. Me neither, Mitch admitted. Seems to be happening a lot lately. Ruth, who'd been quietly cleaning up lunch debris, spoke up. Nothing wrong with tears when they're honest ones. You're all doing the hard work of being truthful with each other. That's worth celebrating. She's right, Brenna said. We haven't been honest with each other in years. Maybe ever. Kyle cleared his throat. Can I say something? When everyone looked at him, he continued, I think we all share blame here. It wasn't just Dad not paying attention. We stopped trying too. I stopped calling because it felt like obligation, not connection. I assumed Dad didn't care about my life because he didn't understand my work. But I never really tried to explain it in ways he could understand. I stopped inviting Dad to things because he said no so many times, Brenna added. Eventually I just assumed he wouldn't come, so I stopped asking. And Joanna's voice, was barely above a whisper. I kept my distance because it was easier than risking disappointment, easier to be angry than to be hurt. The admissions hung in the air between them, each one a small offering toward understanding. We're all pretty broken, aren't we? Kyle said, but there was something almost affectionate in his tone. Maybe, Mitch replied. Or maybe we're just finally admitting the cracks were always there. They spent the afternoon working together, something they hadn't done since the children were young. Mitch showed them the small shed he wanted to build for tools, and Kyle immediately started calculating dimensions. Brenna found his father's old handplane and asked him to show her how to use it. Even Joanna, still guarded but present, helped measure and mark lumber. The work created a different kind of conversation, easier, focused on the task at hand rather than the weight of their shared history. They made mistakes and laughed about them. Kyle's first cut was crooked, Brenna nearly planed her finger, Joanna hammered her thumb and swore colourfully enough to make them all pause before dissolving into laughter. By evening, they'd framed the basic structure of the shed. It wasn't finished, but the skeleton stood solid, a collaboration none of them had expected when they'd arrived that morning. They built a fire in the cabin's fireplace, the first one lit since completion. The stone chimney drew perfectly, smoke rising clean and straight. They sat around it as darkness fell outside on the floor, since Mitch only had one chair, passing around Ruth's leftover cookies, talking with a ease that felt both foreign and familiar. Would Grandpa Frank like what you did here? Joanna asked suddenly, looking around at the cabin's interior. Mitch considered the question carefully. I think he'd like that it brought us back together. That was always his dream for this place, somewhere family could gather. That's what he wanted, Kyle agreed quietly. Family. They sat in comfortable silence, fire crackling, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Brenna spoke. I think we should make this a tradition. Coming here, I mean. Not just once, but regularly, all of us. I'd like that, Mitch said, surprised by how much he meant it. Me too, Kyle added. Joanna nodded. Yeah, okay, but Dad, you have to actually answer when we call and ask real questions, not just how are you and then zone out. Deal, Mitch said, and you all have to be honest when something's wrong. No more polite distance. If you're hurt or angry, say so. That's going to be uncomfortable, Brenna observed. Probably, Mitch agreed. But maybe. They stayed until late, reluctant to break the fragile peace they'd built. When they finally prepared to leave, the goodbyes felt different, longer, more substantial. Hugs instead of handshakes, promises to call that sounded sincere. As their taillights disappeared down the fire road, Mitch stood on the porch and felt something settle in his chest. They weren't fixed. They weren't even close to healed. But they'd started something today that might, with time and effort, become real connection. The cabin had done what he'd hoped. It had given them a reason to come home. 3 months after completion, the cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a gathering place, exactly as Frank Rowen had dreamed 40 years earlier. Autumn had arrived in full force, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The air carried that particular crispness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Mitch had spent the weeks since his children's first visit establishing a new rhythm for his life, splitting time between the cabin and a small apartment he'd rented in Ridgemont. The suburban house in Asheville was sold. Too many rooms, too many memories of a marriage that had ended. He'd divided the proceeds with Diane, sent her half without discussion or negotiation. It felt right, fair. She'd invested 35 years in that house and their life together. She deserved to start fresh with resources, not just hope. His apartment in Ridgemont was simple, 1 bedroom, kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, but it had everything he needed. Vernon had helped him find it, knew the landlord personally. The town had welcomed him fully now, not as a stranger passing through, but as one of their own. He had coffee with Hugh twice a week, discussing projects and philosophy in equal measure. Ruth fed him more often than necessary, maternal in her insistence that he needed proper meals. The cabin remained his true home, though. He spent weekends there consistently, sometimes full weeks when the weather allowed. The space had taken on a life of its own, well worn in the best way, marked by use and care. Kyle had visited twice more, once alone and once bringing his partner, someone Mitch had heard about but never met. They'd spent a weekend helping install proper plumbing, upgrading the cabin's functionality. Kyle's partner, a quiet man named Ian, who worked in software development, had commented that the cabin felt peaceful in a way their Charlotte apartment never did. Brenna came most frequently, sometimes bringing friends from her teaching community who wanted to escape the city. She'd claimed the loft as her space, left books on the shelves Mitch had built, contributed small decorations that made the cabin feel lived in rather than just functional. Joanna remained the most distant, but even she had visited once more, stayed overnight in a sleeping bag by the fireplace, and admitted the next morning that she'd slept better than she had in months. She'd promised to return for Thanksgiving, actually committed to a date rather than offering vague maybes. The local preservation society had asked Mitch to lead a workshop that spring, building with purpose, traditional cabin construction. 20 people had already signed up, eager to learn from the man who'd completed his father's 40-year-old dream. The idea of teaching still felt strange, but Vernon had convinced him. "You've got knowledge worth sharing," Vernon had said. "And teaching is just another way of building, helping other people create something that matters." Diane had written back, a shorter letter this time, but warm. She was painting seriously now, had sold 3 pieces through a small gallery in Portland. She was seeing someone, mentioned casually, not asking permission but offering the information as a courtesy. Mitch had felt surprisingly okay about it, glad even that she'd found connection again. They'd never be married again, would probably never be truly close, but they could be kind to each other from a distance. That was more than many divorced couples managed. One weekend in late October, all 3 children arrived together, planned this time, coordinated through a group text chain Brenna had started. They brought sleeping bags and groceries, prepared to stay 2 nights. They worked together on projects Mitch had outlined, building a proper woodshed, clearing trails through the property, splitting firewood for winter. The labor created conversation, removed the pressure of sitting face to face, forcing intimacy. They could talk while working, pause when emotions ran high, resume when ready. Saturday evening, they sat around the fireplace as darkness fell. Mitch had cooked venison stew on the wood stove recipe from Ruth, who'd written it out carefully on an index card. The meal was simple but satisfying, and they ate from mismatched bowls Brenna had collected from thrift stores specifically for the cabin. "This feels right," Kyle said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Being here together. It does." Brenner agreed. I wish we'd had this growing up, a place that was just ours, away from everything else. We have it now, Joanna pointed out. Better late than never, right? Mitch looked at his 3 children, adults now, carrying their own wounds and wisdom, and felt gratitude so profound it almost hurt. They'd come back. Not because they had to, not out of obligation, but because they'd chosen to. The cabin had given them that choice, provided neutral ground where old patterns could shift into something new. Your grandfather would be happy, Mitch said, seeing all of us here. This is what he wanted, family gathering in a place he built. A place you both built, Kyle corrected gently. We finished it, Mitch replied, gesturing to include all of them. That shed out there, the trails, all the improvements since that first weekend, that's all of us working together. They sat quietly, fire crackling, each lost in thought, but connected by presence. Eventually, conversation resumed, lighter topics, funny stories from work, plans for upcoming holidays, debate about whether to get a generator for the cabin or keep it purely solar-powered. Sunday morning, before they left, Joanna asked if she could take a small piece of wood from the original cabin ruins, something to keep at her apartment in Atlanta. Mitch found a section of hand-hewn beam his father had shaped, cut a piece small enough to display on a shelf. So I remember, Joanna said, holding it carefully. What's possible when you commit to finishing something? After they'd driven away, Mitch walked the property alone, checking on everything with the practiced eye of someone responsible for its care. The cabin stood solid against the mountain backdrop, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left coals banked in the stove. Birds moved through branches overhead. The creek ran clear over stones his father had walked beside decades ago. He'd come here broken, seeking something he couldn't name. He'd found purpose in the work, connection through the building, healing in the slow accumulation of days spent creating rather than consuming. The cabin hadn't fixed everything. His marriage was still ended. Years of distance from his children couldn't be erased by a few weekends together. But it had given them all something tangible, a place to return to, a reason to keep trying, proof that broken things could be rebuilt if you were willing to do the work. Mitch sat on the porch as afternoon sun slanted through the trees, warming the wood beneath his hands. He touched the door frame, solid, permanent, real, and spoke quietly to the mountain air, to his father's memory, to whatever came next. We're not done yet. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't afraid of the work ahead.